And I now see attendees joining. Hello, everybody. Thanks so much for jumping on the call. We'll just give everybody a minute to join the call, and then we'll start speaking on our end for real. And I'll just repeat myself one more time. Thanks to everybody joining the call here. We will start the session at exactly 9 o'clock Eastern American time and 3 o'clock Central European time. So we'll start speaking in a minute, in other words. Good morning and good afternoon to everybody joining this executive morning brief. I have the pleasure of saying both good morning and good afternoon, as today's morning brief topic is sustainability in the US, focusing obviously very much on the upcoming election in just a few short weeks. My name is Tobias. I'll be hosting the event from CBS Executive Foundation's side. Now, we from CBS Executive are hosting these executive morning briefs as part of a general effort to take a position within sustainable leadership and transformation. We want to take this position, obviously, because we believe that the transition to sustainable business is an absolute key task for leaders across the globe these years. And that we believe that we in the Nordic countries are in a rather unique position to support this transition. I'm joined today by Julia, Eric, and Andreas, who are all in their own way experts within this field. I'll give a proper introduction to the three of you in just a minute. I just have a few practical remarks and a brief Slido poll before we hand it to the three of you to do the discussion for the key part of the session. Now, in terms of introductory remarks, you are in a Zoom webinar setting, which essentially means that you are muted. We will, however, take questions. Please feel free to use the Q&A function here in Zoom. It's always enriching to hear your questions, so please feel free to ask anything that's on your mind. Final sort of practical thing from my side is that we are recording the session today, and we will send a recording to everybody who have signed up through our webpage. We have built today's session around three key questions that Andreas, Eric, and Julia will debate in just a minute. Where does sustainability stand in the US after the anti-ESG backlash? What are the likely implications of a Harris-Walz or Trump-Vance victory for the sustainability agenda? And finally, how should global firms navigate the differing ESG regulation landscape in the EU and the US, respectively? Those are the three questions that our experts will debate in a second. In terms of proper introduction, Eric is with us from Pennsylvania. Eric is Gardsmark Professor at the Wharton School. Julia is joining us from Brussels in the middle of Europe. Julia is Managing Director and CSO for Position Green. And finally, we have Andreas with us. Andreas is professor here with us in Copenhagen at Copenhagen Business School. Andreas is Professor of Business in Society here. Now, to get the debate going, we have a brief Slido. Next slide will be a Slido. So I'll ask you to either take out your phones and scan the upcoming QR code or log on to slido.com and provide the password in the bottom left corner of your screen. And please answer in just a few words, 2-3 words, answer the question, what you consider the biggest sustainability achievement of the Biden-Harris administration. And I will just give everybody a minute to provide their answers. And as answers are coming in, I'll slowly hand it to you, Andreas. Thanks so much for joining us again here on this Executive Morning Brief. Looking very much forward to hearing your discussion today.
Yes, thanks a lot, Tobias, and warm welcome to everybody on the call. And of course, I'm also looking forward to see. I already see IRA written here. Not surprising, but of course, it's something that we will come across in the debate. But it surely is something. It surely is something that we aim to debate. Also, very warm welcome to Eric and Julia. It is really great to have you with us here for this debate about a US perspective on sustainability, and also, of course, with regard to the EU comparison. There is a lot going on, both in the US and in Europe, with regard to regulations. And of course, one key question we want to debate today, I mean, how do both regions compare, and how can we actually move towards comparison of both regions, and what can also corporations do once they operate in both regions. So we already see now here the answers coming in. It has a lot to do with the IRA, the Green New Deal, which of course it's maybe something we can also again pick up in our discussion, and the update on the environmental executive order. So that of course also relates to some of the regulatory perspectives on this. Now, let me start with the first question, and the question I'd like to pick you, Eric, for this first. There was a big backlash. I mean, there was this big ESG backlash in the US. I mean, we had these boom years of ESG, 21, 22. You could sell almost anything as ESG. And then there was a big backlash, which was rather political. And a lot here in Europe, a lot of people looked at this with kind of raised eyebrows and were trying to figure out really what was happening. Where does the US stand right now after this ESG backlash?
Well, thanks very much. Thanks very much, Andreas. And thanks, first of all, for the invitation here. And I'm really happy to be here and to be part of the panel. So let me also start by saying some of the topics that we're going to get into here are political. I've been fairly active in my private side of life in politics. And so some of the answers here will be related to my personal political views. Others will be related to my work as a teacher at Wharton, as a researcher, but I don't speak on behalf of the Wharton School. I feel like I'm a member of the Securities and Exchange Commission and giving that kind of disclosure, but I think it's important in this context because it is very, in the United States right now, it is very political on campuses in many respects, and I think we're especially attentive to making these kinds of distinctions. So, on ESG, I think ESG has been a controversial issue in the United States. In part, the ESG question has been politicized by groups in a way that is surprising because the reason for this, and this particularly refers to Republicans and especially the MAGA movement, the Make America Great Again movement within the Republican Party. I think they selected ESG as something to target. And it has as much to do with diversity issues and the diversity and equity and inclusion issues that have been part of understanding ESG in the United States context at least. And of course, in the United States, we have a much more fraught history of racism that we're continuing to work through, and it's a key part of the political situation. But that was packed into the ESG analysis, and so some of those who were proponents of ESG and some of them are on my faculty at the Wharton School, were, I think, a bit surprised because their view of ESG was a relatively, in my view, conservative one that saw ESG in financial terms only. And so their understanding of ESG, as I understand it, is really that they're instrumentalizing what I would describe from a business ethics background as instrumental stakeholder theory. In other words, you care about ESG, but only to the extent that it's actually going to return, make returns on the bottom line investment. If you're looking at it from a firm, from an investment point of view, or if you're a firm, you do ESG if it's making you money, and not otherwise. So the backlash politically took, I think, some people who are promoting ESG from a financial point of view as a surprise. Now, I think that, we can get more into why this was happening, et cetera. So the way the question's formed is that this is kind of over. I don't think it is over. One of the reasons, and we're going to get into this later, Andreas, we talked about this before, one of the reasons that you don't see, I think, climate very high on the political agenda is that there is still a focus on DEI and ESG as a political issue that the Republican Party and the Trump candidacy are still pushing. And they're against it, and they want it to be rolled back, and they see it as a way in which to attack woke capitalism, and it is still, I think, a salient political issue here in the U.S. So I'm not sure if I fully answered the question, but maybe that's a good introduction. I think the backlash is still happening. Also, one other footnote, I guess, and Andreas, I'll take the opportunity to plug our forthcoming book on ESG. But as you know from my chapter in that book that we're co-editing, I think that there are significant academic problems with ESG that were present from the start. And this idea of ESG as only financial materiality, that gets into the big debate about double materiality, what are we really trying to do here, et cetera. So in fact, I think some of the opening for politicization, sorry, it's too early in the morning here for me to pronounce my words, is that there's a conceptual kind of problem within how we've been thinking about ESG. And we really, in my view, need to go kind of beyond ESG to look at, as you were indicating, some of the regulatory solutions that will, I think, give people better faith in what we're really trying to do when we talk about this.
Okay, I mean, this beyond ESG idea is an interesting one. Let's debate it later. Julia, I mean, you are in Brussels, but you also know the US very well positioned. Green also has US offices, so you know both sides of the Atlantic. What do you make out of this question? I mean, where do you see kind of sustainability right now in the US if we consider kind of these very politicized discussions?
Yeah, thank you, Andreas, and thanks for inviting me here today. So my everyday life is that I consult with large and medium-sized companies. So I spend my time every day with executives, with board members that actually have to deal with the reality out there, that have to deal with this very politicized landscape around ESG. And I also work for many, many companies, and we as Position Green work for many companies who are active on both sides of the Atlantic. And for them, let me tell you, the ESG backlash is very real, and not only in the US, but also the EU. One of the executives I was with last week, he runs a very large international group, has a very distinguished career. He doesn't run it. He's the chairman of the board now. He's the chairman of the board, so he's not even an executive. And before becoming a non-exec, he was running one of the largest retailers in the world. And it was very clear that he felt this tension with his personal values. So in the past, ESG was something he could use also to make his personal conviction and his legacy a success. And now he feels this tension between what he believed as an executive that is now maybe 60, 65, and the world he's facing, the real world he's facing, the questions he suddenly faces from the big big shareholders, from the Vanguards, from the BlackRocks, the public discourse that he has to participate in, the kind of questions he gets asked on panels in the US, but also in Europe. And that is an extremely difficult environment for companies to deal with. And let me tell you, it's not only the US, it's also the EU, very much so. So ever since, in particular, the war in Ukraine, and also because political parties on the right have politicized ESG also here in Europe, you have almost the same climate here. And then you need to tread very carefully, because at the same time as you need to tread very carefully in what you say publicly and the kind of policies you espouse, you also know that ESG risks are real. And you know that financial risks are real. And you know that if you don't have an inclusive work environment, you're just not going to find any people to work for you, in particular if you're a Western company, right? And you also know that if you don't take climate change serious, you will not get insured anymore. You might even be kicked out of by your bank. So it's in no way an issue that has gone away. It's come really, really to the fore, not only in the US, but also in Europe. The difference, I would say, between Europe and the US is that in the US, you just cannot talk about it. You know, as a business leader, and this is also what I advise my clients, don't call it ESG. Call it the transition, call it investments in clean tech, call it investment in making sure that we don't have to expose our kids to a polluted environment. So it's a matter of choosing the right words. But behind the scenes, of course, there is a lot more needed to actually turn sustainability into a communicable and into a value creating strategy for businesses.
That's an interesting observation, because I also kind of saw this with Larry Fink. You know, his shareholder letters for, I think, a couple of years, he used this ESG terminology very heavily, and then suddenly he dropped it. But he didn't drop some of the content, actually. He just framed it very differently. So it's also a linguistic discussion which we have here. Eric, would you agree? I mean, do you also see this, you know, that people simply drop the language but stick to the content?
Yeah, I think that's true. So I agree entirely with Julia's assessment of where companies are, and it's interesting to hear, but although it confirms what I had been thinking, that Europe is not that far away from the US and also being very concerned about the issue. And in Europe, of course, you have the additional question of actual regulations that are going into effect that have a much more significant effect than the ones that we currently have in the US. And that will get that foreshadows our discussion about what's happening politically, because it's going to be very different if we have a Trump administration compared to a Harris administration, and that will probably affect Europe also. I think, though, that there was a fundamental problem in the ESG formulation originally, and that there is a tension that we can't. You mentioned this, Julia, in your example. There is a real tension between trying to do the right thing sometimes with respect to sustainability, or let's just pick the climate as a very important topic, and maximizing your returns. And the problem is that in some environments, and with respect to some investors you may talk to, or in the US, there are even laws that say you can't consider anything else for your investors but the financial returns. And so when you have the normative structure, that sometimes a legally mandatory normative structure saying maximize returns or maximize returns to shareholders, and in fact, I would say that's probably the standard way that we teach at the Wharton School. Most of the courses, not mine, but I'm an exception, teach shareholder maximization as the basic rule of the game. And in my view, the truth of the matter is, if we're really going to make some progress here, we cannot pretend that win-win solutions are always going to get us ahead. And I think that was that to me is the real problem with ESG, not as it was originally conceived when the UN and major institutional investors were thinking about it. But as it was then being sold to people, et cetera, there was this idea that it's a win-win, that all these different things, including the climate, diversity, everything else, if you do better on these criteria, you're also going to make the most money possible. And the truth of the matter is that that's just not how the world works. And so we have to really look carefully at some of the underlying reasons why that's the case, and then work within the constraints that a lot of businesses really do feel. And to be honest about that. Now, I think in the BlackRock case, there's a lot of evidence that, and I'll just say evidence, I don't think it's proven, that BlackRock was maybe a little bit greenwashing, and that the ESG that they were selling kind of worked, and they made a lot of money while that was popular. And then when it's not popular and they had a backlash, particularly from state legislatures in Texas and some other conservative states in the US, they said, oh, wait a second, well, if it's really going to cut into our bottom line, we're not talking about ESG anymore, and we're going to talk about something else. But to me, that indicates a lack of real seriousness about how much are you as a company really ready to move this issue forward, or as some of the critics of BlackRock have said really early on, is this really a strategy so that you don't get regulation? And that's one of my punchlines here is I think businesses are constrained by a lot of these background norms, and that businesses should try to get over what has been a market fundamentalist kind of approach that I think comes from a Hayekian, Frederick Hayek's view of the economy and Milton Friedman view of the economy, that somehow markets are always more efficient at solving problems than governments. And if you look at something like climate change or racial discrimination, it just isn't going to work that way, right? Markets are not going to solve the problem. You have to have regulation to come in and solve some kinds of problems. And so in that case, a forward-looking business, I think, should be honest and say, look, we're constrained. We have to make money. We're in business. That's our raison d'etre is profits. However, we also care about these other issues, but we're not going to just be good and lose business. We'll be good, but we don't want to have regulations that everybody has to be good. So we'll be a leader on climate, but that means we have to have a level playing field here that everyone has to play on. And it has to be mandatory to some extent. Otherwise, you're asking businesses to sacrifice themselves, except maybe there may be a few deep green businesses like Patagonia, which I love too, but the world can't just change to become these other, these kinds of businesses without a regulatory kind of approach. So that's kind of my bottom line, is that businesses that really want to be leaders should think about good regulation.
Yeah, great points also on the business case. I'm also always telling my students, you don't always need, or you should not always need a business case to do the right thing. So this is my punchline in a sense. Julia, the election is ahead of us. Where do you see, as a non-US citizens, looking at it from the outside, I mean, what do you think are likely implications? We basically have two tickets here. We have the Harris-Walz and we have the Trump-Vance ticket. We all know they differ greatly on the sustainability agenda, but what do you think are likely implications of both scenarios in terms of course, sustainability for corporations?
Yeah, and the way I usually talk about this is that you of course have to separate policy from reality. And when you look at policy, you have to separate disclosure policy and also financial regulation from real economy regulations, such as the regulation of clean tech, the regulation of clean energy, the regulation of the transition in general. So in this, when I talk to this distinction on policy, we will have two different worlds. Of course, we know that. We will have two different worlds. On the substance, and that's the good news, and we always need to state the good news as well. Not all hope is lost. Even if Trump and Vance win, not all hope is lost. We see that the green transition is really, really gathering steam in the US. I mean, it's impressive what the IRA, it was mentioned the Slido in the beginning, of course. We call it IRA, by the way, in Europe, because IRA also means something else in Europe. So in Brussels, we call it IRA. I know in the US, is it right, Eric? You actually say IRA? Inflation Reduction?
Yeah, we do. We forgot about that history.
Yeah, we call it IRA. The European bureaucrats will call it IRA, but we understand each other. So I say IRA, not IRA. So the IRA has, of course, been a landmark regulation, and now it's showing the effect. Not all funds have necessarily been spent in the most efficient way, and would be very interested in Eric's views on that. But clearly a shift is happening, and it was such a huge signal to the whole world, not only to the US, that are pouring so much money into the green transition. And that will continue. And the Biden administration has been extremely smart in putting in place these guardrails so that how much can Trump really rail back and roll back on the IRA? Not much. Most of the money has been dispersed. What he can do is, of course, then go after the agencies who have dispersed the money, because it's happened very fast by design. But it's rolling. The ball is rolling, and there are such encouraging signs, grassroots signs. Now, I read the other day, I think it was actually yesterday in the FT Moral Money, that green banks, so non-for-profit lending institutions that are essential, for example, for the renovation of the building stock, which is a real problem in the Western world, right? Our houses are not insulated enough, they're not energy efficient enough. I mean, that's just going through the roof. So you have the real transition is happening. For worldwide, every dollar invested in fossil fuels, $2 are invested in renewable energy. That was Al Gore's investment outfit that came up with a study here last week. So, you know, that transition will continue to roll. Renewable energy is so cheap now, it just makes business sense. But on the policy side, it will be markedly different. And the big difference here will, of course, be on the disclosure side, where we in Europe have a very, very ambitious disclosure regime in place, where if Trump wins, there will be no disclosures, and he will do, of course, his utmost to also stop any financial regulation, ESG regulation that the SEC might be thinking about. It's disclosure rules on scope 1 and 2. Will fight the California climate bills. All of that will not happen, right? With Harris, that would be very, very different. I guess that she will also tread carefully, because she will not want to aggravate certain voter groups, not even in the beginning of her legislative term. And maybe Eric has a different. He has an inside view, I hear, on the Democratic Party lines. I would be interested in hearing what you say there. But under Trump, we know that the signaling effect will just be massive, right? And what it means for the business world is that you will see this stronger divergence on policy between Europe and the US, but also importantly between China and the US. Because if Trump wins, then we know who is the superpower on sustainability, China. There's no question. Then China will win the sustainable transition race. They will. They're already ahead with the massive subsidies they have poured into solar, into EVs, into batteries. So that will be a very, very real impact for the business world as well, that they will feel in terms of competitiveness, right? Because China will continue to subsidize. If the US pulls out of this whole game, we will not be in a good place for the US industry, right? So that will have an impact.
Very interesting global policy perspective that you bring up here. And just to the audience, I mean, please ask questions. We are happy to take them. And I hand it over to Eric. I mean, on the question, Trump Vance versus Harris Walz, where do you see implications? Maybe also building a bit on what Julia has said.
Yeah, well, thanks. I guess I should also say that even though I'm a strong supporter of Harris Walz, I don't speak for the campaign. So I don't speak for Warren. I'm speaking for myself.
This is not a campaign event. This
is
not a campaign
it's not a campaign event. Although I do go to, I've just been invited to a campaign event. And just to give you an indication, I mean, one thing that I think, well, first of all, the reality is it's a toss-up right now. It's a little bit discouraging to someone like me who sees so many difficulties with what happened with Trump before and what happened in the last election. And so it's a little bit worrisome that this really is a toss-up. So it's going to come down to about 6 different states under the electoral college system of the United States. My own sense is that there's a lot of enthusiasm for the Harris Walz ticket right now. I'm not sure the polls are necessarily picking that up, but there are a lot of variables. So I don't want to prognosticate too much, but I think that younger voters really care about the climate. And we can talk a little bit more about this. I was talking offline with Andreas about this, why the Harris campaign is really not making a big deal of the climate right now. But I think the reality is that if you really care about the climate, as I do, for example, or as other professionals do, or people in the renewable energy business do, they are backing Harris. So I actually tried to meet, I tried to go to a fundraiser. There's Climate Week in New York City this week. And I tried to sign up for a fundraiser that I heard about with with Tim Walz, vice presidential candidate, who has an extremely good climate record, by the way, in Minnesota. And Jay Inslee, who I actually backed in a personal capacity again in 2020 on the primary, who was the governor of Washington and is one of the leaders on the climate issue. I backed him because I'm sort of a green Democrat, and he was the candidate who was pushing the green climate agenda the furthest. So, but it was sold out. So it sold out really quickly. And I think it's an indication that the clean tech, and these were not small amounts of money that they were asking either. So there are really serious business interests that are part of this green transition, that are beneficiaries, as Julia was saying, from the Inflation Reduction Act, which is it's really not about inflation reduction. It's mostly, that's like a political name for it. It mostly is a climate bill. And it is the biggest forward climate policy that's ever been passed in the United States, maybe even the world, because the subsidy levels are much higher than in Europe, maybe even higher as a percentage of, well, I'm not sure about China. And I'm a lot less sanguine about China being a leader in this area. I think they're a leader in some of the technologies, but they're also the leader in climate emissions right now too. So I'm not really sure I see China's becoming a replacement of the United States. So anyway, the bottom line here is that there's a huge difference between Harris-Walz and Trump-Vance. If you have Trump-Vance win, it's a disaster. There's no way to look at this as like not bad or good. It's a disaster with respect to climate. Trump again will pull out of the Paris Agreement, which was a disaster the first time, and it would be a disaster again. He's pledged to reverse the IRA. So it depends then what the outcome is in Congress. But if Trump wins and he wins the House and the Senate, you can say goodbye to the IRA. You can say, I don't know what we should call it. You can say goodbye to the Harris climate, the Biden-Harris climate bill. You can say goodbye, as you said, Julie, to all the disclosure ideas. The SEC will reverse what they've passed, which is kind of relatively, I think, somewhat useless anyway, and it doesn't really have a lot of bite anyway. You're going to have a challenge to the California disclosure laws, and you're going to basically have burn, baby, burn. You're going to have, the U.S. is already now a leader in oil and natural gas production again. They're going to take off the any regulatory. To the extent possible, Trump will reward the oil companies. You may have seen that he had a fundraiser for lots of oil companies and basically said, if you give me $1 billion, I'll give you free rein to do whatever you want. So this is clearly in the political economic realities, this really is a fight between status quo companies that want to continue to burn fossil fuels and pretend that climate's not a problem, and those who really want to try to do something about it. So because that issue is so clear, they're not really talking about it. And another feature of the campaign that's somewhat disappointing to me, but it's just a reality of the political situation, is that the Harris-Walz campaign isn't really talking about the climate that much. That's not their priority. And the reason is that most voters don't care that much. So you have me, who's like a very strong dark green citizen, but we're really very small in number. What most people are caring about in the United States today is basic economic issues. A lot of people have not recovered from losing their homes during the Great Recession. A lot more people have not recovered from the COVID crisis and a failure to really protect a lot of people during that. There's been job growth, but it's really not hitting everyone equally. And you've had some persistent inflation. And so the focus and housing is very difficult for people. So that's the focus of the Harris campaign and why you're not hearing a lot about climate. But it really is critical, I think, to the world that the Harris-Walz group win, because then we'll be in a position to continue discussions about how can Europe and the United States and other democracies, in my view, that's the way that we solve climate globally. The democracies of the world have to come together and start to craft unified approaches to try to help solve the problem. And so it's the stakes are really high.
Right. Thank you for your analysis, Eric. I think it's interesting how you both view, and I think there are lots of complementarities between your views. Julia, again, I mean, you have a lot of experience also with kind of executives that have their foot in both the EU and US market. How should firms navigate these kind of differences between the US and Eric just talked about it, right? The IRA or IRA in the US, which is a quite different regime than what we have here in Europe. In Europe, every disclosure is everything, right? I mean, we have built a system with the taxonomy and the CSRD, which is very disclosure focused, and we basically hope that financial markets reallocate capital at some point. In the US, they go the subsidy route and keep it light on disclosure, or actually not very much existing on the disclosure side. How do you navigate these tensions if you have a company that operates in both markets?
Yeah, and what I always say and what we always discuss with every board and every executive is actually it's quite simple. It's very simple. You just focus on the issues that are really material to a company. And then, of course, you get underneath, what does it mean, material? And then you have financial materiality, and then you have impact materiality. And then we start discussing. And you know what, the interesting thing that what then always happens when we discuss financial materiality and impact materiality, so financial materiality is the material ESG issues that have a financial impact on your company, be it revenues that will increase because you sell green tech, or be it floods that will raise your insurance premiums. And the impact materiality is the impact that you as a company have on, for example, climate change, on, you know, if you build a big warehouse over a river and then there are floods, that's a negative impact you have. But then when we start discussing financial impact and financial materiality and impact materiality, at the end, we always conclude, actually, they're not that different. Because impact materiality will always come back to the firm as well in terms of reputational risk, in terms of risk of attrition of key employees, of employer branding. So sometimes I think this whole discussion on double materiality is also a little bit an invention by the academics, maybe. And by the bureaucrats and regulators.
Oh, it's more, we always blame it on the policymakers, you know.
Yeah, exactly. Let's blame them. Essentially, there will be a set of issues, and it will be 3 to 4 for every company that are really material. And those, no matter where your business is, in the US or in the EU, you have to work with very, very diligently. The difference between tackling the US climate and the European climate is, in the US, you have to have a really good comms strategy, and a really good strategy and a really cautious strategy on how you talk about sustainability and ESG externally, because it's just such a polarized environment. But you should certainly talk about the issues, the environmental issues, the social issues, the governance issues that are material to your business. You just have to frame it in the right way, and then you have to do the right things about it. So it's very interesting, this company that I was with, that I referred to, you know, when you look at their European business and the US business, there are clearly tensions on sustainability between the two, but the tension is mainly around the Europeans wanting all the disclosures and having to do the CSRD and having to publish all these pages and pages of the report. Whereas if you look at the actual action and what the company is doing on the material issues, they're much better in the US. So the actual outcome of their sustainability practices, of their actions, they are actually very, very good in the US. They also have data. It might not be comparable. There might be a little bit of greenwashing involved, but still there's a lot of good actions going on. Whereas the Europeans right now are completely distracted by all the disclosure hoo-ha and, oh my God, it's so bad and it's so much red tape. And, you know, that's no way to deal with regulation and executive either. So that I always warn my clients about, you know, it's not in a very strategic perspective to moan about the implementation of a legislation. It's going to take you maybe a year to implement, maybe 2 years, and then it's done. And then the cost is gone. And of course you have to do it, but you also have to do financial accounting, right? You need to look at what is material to your company, make sure that you get the compliance out of the way on the disclosures that you need to publish, but then really hone in on the issues that you want to show a competitive advantage on as well. So we talk now, when I talk to clients, we talk about the transition, how they are gonna deal with the transition, because the transition is real. Do you want to die? You know, if you're an airport, there will be lockdowns in the future. You will not be able to collect any more tariffs from the airlines because the air in London will be so bad, no plane is allowed to take off. So you need to deal with this. You need to build it in your business plans, right? That's real. It's not a political question. A political question is how you communicate around sustainability, and to some extent also how you align disclosures between the US and European businesses. But that's technical stuff. That's not a strategic question.
Okay, very good analysis. Thank you. I like that. Also, your many different perspectives on this question that you were kind of bringing in. Eric, what would your advice be to someone who leads a company maybe in the US and in Europe and has to make sense of all of this ESG sustainability kind of game? Maybe this is also a word we can use.
Yeah, well, I think in the current circumstance, one of the things to look at if you're a business, one of the financially material truths of the current election is that if you just look at the taxes, then you personally and your company are probably better off if Trump wins from a transactional point of view, because the Harris campaign is going to raise, they're not going to raise it as much as the Biden budget had proposed, but they're going to raise the corporate tax, and they're going to raise taxes on those who are making more than $400,000 a year. And so if you take a purely transactional, and I'm afraid a financially material point of view, then you may say, I like Trump better than I like Harris Walz because it's clear that I'm going to win. Harris Walz is taxing me. This is immediate detriment to our company and to my own personal tax situation. And what I think this is one of the things that I'm very concerned about, because to the extent that that helps to explain why Trump's even in the running here. I mean, if you look at what this guy's a criminal, he tried to destroy the democracy. You can go on and on about the problems with Trump's character. A bunch of national security. Many people have worked with him in national security. His own former vice president, they're all the former Secretary of Defense, have all said the guy's unqualified. And so you have to wonder, how in the hell is he still in the race? And the reason is a lot of big business interests want to see this as transactional, and they know that he's not in favor of regulation. He's going to roll back regulation. And so if you don't like regulation and you want lower taxes, you vote for Trump, and then you'll fund whatever helps get him elected, and you don't care. Is it baiting? Is it going after immigrants? Is it whatever the rhetoric is? You don't care, because what you're really funding is your own self-interest. So I think that's an example where this really hits directly to what are your moral values. Because if you care, with respect, there's a lot of choices that we can make, for example, on climate. And Julia, you went over a lot of them. Like, there's a choice, to summarize it, there's a choice between what I would call informational regulation and disclosure, which there's a choice on subsidies, which the US is now kind of leading, although China also is running things according to a subsidy regime. Or you can use the four-letter word called tax in the US. And a lot of economists say, well, that's the way that we should regulate climate. But of course, a lot of people don't like taxes. And so it becomes politically difficult. But the thing is, we have to agree to have that debate. We have to agree to put this on a policy side and say, climate is a huge necessary issue. And even if whatever side of the political spectrum you're on, we have to come together and address the issue. So, and right now, unfortunately, and this hasn't always been true in the United States, the entire Republican Party is under the thrall of Trump and those who want to do nothing on the climate issue. And to the extent that that's true, that's why we're going to have a disaster. So if Trump wins, so that's the big pitch I think that many businesses have to look at, is put in the long-term understanding. A lot of the other factors that Julia mentioned, think about what about your grandchildren. You really have to put this in moral terms, because it doesn't just pencil out that it's okay to lose money with respect to your taxes. You have to bring in other kinds of values to say, let's figure out what the smart regulation is to do, but let's all agree that we have to really move the world forward on this.
All right, thank you very much, Eric, and also Julia, both of you. I mean, this was a really, really interesting debate. I think we covered so many different perspectives of this topic, and I think it also shows, you know, business ethics is alive, right? Politics is alive, business ethics is alive, and we cannot think strategy in a vacuum. We always need to kind of have these other perspectives as well. So thank you very much for being here today, and I hand it back to Tobias for the final words.
And thank you to the three of you for a very, very lively and very, very interesting discussion. What is left for me to say is, just get my slides on here. Only two very brief things. We have an upcoming executive leadership program called Sustainable Leadership and Transformation. You can check that out on our website. It is starting January next year. The next executive morning brief that we will host, we will double click on circular economy. Andreas will in this one engage with Julia Binder from IMD Business School. And we will host that on October 31st, 9 to 9:45 this time, Central European time. Thank you to our panelists, Eric, Julia, Andreas, for a very lively discussion. Thank you to all our participants. Have a lovely day and/or afternoon, wherever you are. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you
and
very
have a good
much.
morning.
Thank you.
Yes,
Have a good,
have a good
morning,
day.
Eric. Yeah, have a good day.
Have a good night.
Take care, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye, Eric. Bye for now.